Welcome, fellow dreamer. You have found a place of calm and rest. This evening, we're going to explore a quiet revolution that transformed the world, the story of Johannes Gutenberg and his remarkable printing press, an invention that would unlock the written word and carry knowledge across continents and centuries. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. If you enjoy these calm adventures with us, don't be shy. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment to help other smart sleepers dream too. And now, take a deep breath, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. In the quietness of medieval Europe, long before machines could reproduce the written word, knowledge moved at the pace of a human hand. Imagine a world where every book, every letter, every document existed only because someone had painstakingly copied it, one careful stroke at a time. This was the reality for centuries, a time when written words were precious beyond what we might easily comprehend today. The heart of this laborious work beat strongest within the thick stone walls of monasteries scattered across the European landscape. In these peaceful sanctuaries, communities of monks dedicated themselves not only to prayer and contemplation but also to the crucial task of preserving and multiplying written texts. Within each monastery stood a special room called the scriptorium, a space devoted entirely to the copying of manuscripts. Here, in chambers lit by narrow windows and perhaps a few candles, scribes bent over their work from dawn until the light failed. Picture these rooms on a typical day. The silence was profound, broken only by the scratch of quill against parchment, the occasional rustle of a page being turned, or the soft footsteps of the brother responsible for maintaining order. Scribes sat at their desks, often for hours without break, their fingers stained with ink, their eyes straining to read the exemplar text before them while simultaneously reproducing it with exacting precision. The work demanded not just literacy, which was rare enough, but extraordinary patience, unwavering attention, and a steady hand that could maintain consistent letter forms across page after page. The materials themselves represented considerable expense. Parchment, made from specially prepared animal skins, required skilled craftsmen to produce. A single large Bible might consume the skins of hundreds of sheep or calves. The preparation process was extensive, involving soaking, scraping, stretching, and treating the skins until they achieved the smooth, durable surface suitable for writing. The very finest parchment, called vellum, came from calfskin and commanded premium prices. Even ink required careful preparation, mixed from ingredients like oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, following recipes passed down through generations. The time required to complete a single manuscript stretched far beyond what most modern minds might imagine. A scribe working diligently could perhaps complete 4 pages in a day, though this varied greatly depending on the size of the writing, the complexity of any decorative elements, and the scribe's own skill level. A complete Bible, with its hundreds of pages, might occupy a scribe for an entire year, or even longer if the work included elaborate decorations. Some of the grandest manuscripts required teams of scribes working together, along with specialized illuminators who added the colorful decorative initial letters and marginal illustrations that made certain books treasured works of art as much as repositories of text. The consequence of this labor-intensive process was inevitable. Books were rare. Books were expensive. A single volume might cost as much as a farm or a house. Universities, when they began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries, often possessed libraries of just a few dozen volumes, each one chained to reading desks to prevent theft. Private ownership of books remained the privilege of royalty, high nobility, and wealthy merchants. For most people, even those who had learned to read, encountering a book was an unusual event. This scarcity shaped the entire relationship between society and written knowledge. When texts were so difficult and expensive to produce, decisions about what to copy carried enormous weight. religious texts naturally took priority, especially Bibles and liturgical books needed for church services. The works of ancient philosophers and scientists were copied in monasteries where the monks recognized their value. Legal codes and royal proclamations required written form. But countless other types of information that we might take for granted today, from practical manuals to contemporary literature, existed in very limited numbers or not at all. The concentration of books in religious institutions and noble courts meant that access to written knowledge remained tightly controlled. If you wanted to consult a particular text, you needed to gain admission to one of the few places where it existed. You might need to travel considerable distances. You would likely need connections, letters of introduction, or some form of special permission. The simple act of reading something became entangled with questions of social class, religious affiliation, and political access. Even for those with access to manuscripts, the experience of reading differed fundamentally from what would come later. Each copy of a text was unique. Scribes, despite their best efforts, made mistakes. They might misread a word in the exemplar, skip a line, or accidentally transpose letters. Some scribes took liberties with texts, adding marginal notes that later copyists might incorporate into the main text, or attempting to correct what they perceived as errors in their source material. Over time and successive copying, different versions of the same work might diverge significantly. Scholars could never be entirely certain that what they read precisely matched what the author had originally written. This world of manuscripts, for all its limitations, had endured for over 1,000 years by the early 15th century. The methods of the scribes had been refined to a high art. The great libraries of Europe, though small by later standards, housed treasured collections. Networks of scriptoria maintained contact with one another, borrowing exemplars and sharing texts. Yet the fundamental constraint remained unchanged. Every book required someone to copy it by hand, word by word, page by page, in a process that could never hope to meet the slowly growing hunger for written knowledge that stirred in the cities and universities of late medieval Europe. As we move forward in our story, we will step even further back in time, to explore how various civilizations first developed methods of recording and preserving information, long before medieval monks bent over their manuscripts in quiet scriptoria. The journey toward the printing press began thousands of years earlier, with humanity's first attempts to make knowledge permanent. Long before medieval monks bent over their copying desks, long before parchment became the precious medium for preserving words, humanity faced a fundamental challenge that shaped the course of civilization. How could thoughts, laws, stories, and knowledge be captured and preserved beyond the fragile limits of human memory? The answer to this question emerged gradually across thousands of years and countless miles, as different cultures developed their own ingenious solutions to recording what mattered most to them. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians discovered something remarkable about the soft clay beneath their feet. Around 3400 BCE, they realized this malleable substance could be shaped and marked while wet, then hardened into a permanent record. Using sharpened reeds, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into small clay tablets, creating what we now call cuneiform writing. These marks represented not just simple pictures but abstract concepts, sounds, and complex ideas. The clay tablets recorded everything from temple inventories and business transactions to epic poetry and astronomical observations. Once dried in the hot Mesopotamian sun or baked in kilns, these tablets became remarkably durable, surviving millennia buried in desert sands while kingdoms rose and fell above them. The process of creating these records required considerable skill and training. Scribes underwent years of education in specialized schools, learning to form the hundreds of different signs that made up the cuneiform system. They sat cross-legged with tablets resting on their knees, carefully impressing each mark at the correct angle and depth. For important documents, multiple copies might be made, though each one required the same painstaking effort as the first. Libraries of these clay tablets accumulated in palace complexes and temples, stored on shelves like the books that would come thousands of years later. The library of Ashurbanipal in ancient Nineveh contained over 30,000 tablets, representing an extraordinary accumulation of knowledge. Meanwhile, along the Nile River, the Egyptians developed their own distinctive method of recording information. The papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the shallow waters and marshes of the delta provided the raw material for a lighter, more portable writing surface. Egyptian craftsmen discovered that by cutting the papyrus stalks into thin strips, laying them in perpendicular layers, and pressing them together, the plant's natural sugars would bind the strips into sheets. These sheets could then be joined edge to create long scrolls, some extending 30 feet or more. Working with reed brushes and ink made from carbon black or red ochre mixed with water and plant gum, Egyptian scribes wrote in elegant hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. Unlike the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, papyrus scrolls could be rolled up for storage and transport, making them practical for longer texts. The Egyptians recorded religious texts, administrative documents, literary works, and mathematical treatises on these scrolls. The famous Book of the Dead, containing spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, was often inscribed on papyrus and placed in tombs with the deceased. The creation of papyrus scrolls represented a considerable industry in ancient Egypt. The manufacturing process required expertise and time, and finished papyrus became a valuable trade commodity throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman civilizations eagerly adopted papyrus for their own record-keeping and literary production. However, papyrus had its limitations. The material was fragile, susceptible to moisture, and would become brittle with age. A torn or damaged scroll might be difficult or impossible to repair, and entire sections of text could be lost. As Greek and Roman civilizations flourished, another writing material gradually gained prominence. Parchment, made from specially prepared animal skins, offered distinct advantages over papyrus. The process of creating parchment involved soaking animal hides, usually from sheep, goats, or calves, in lime to remove hair and flesh. The cleaned skins were then stretched on frames and scraped smooth with curved blades, creating a pale, even writing surface that could be used on both sides. Parchment proved far more durable than papyrus and was less affected by moisture or climate. Its strength allowed for a revolutionary change in book format. Rather than rolling long scrolls, sheets of parchment could be folded and bound together at one edge, creating the codex format that resembles modern books. This innovation, which gradually took hold during the Roman Empire's later centuries, made texts far easier to navigate. Readers could flip directly to specific sections rather than unrolling and rolling lengthy scrolls. The codex format also proved more compact and portable than scrolls of equivalent length. The finest parchment, called vellum, came from calfskin and provided an exceptionally smooth, luminous surface prized for important manuscripts. However, producing parchment required substantial resources. A single large book might consume the skins of an entire herd of animals. This expense meant that writing materials themselves represented significant value, even before considering the labor of copying text onto them. In the Far East, China developed yet another approach to recording knowledge. By the 2nd century CE, Chinese craftsmen had perfected the art of making paper from plant fibers, creating a material that was lighter and less expensive than parchment while being more practical than papyrus in many climates. The technique involved pulping plant materials, spreading the resulting slurry onto screens to drain and dry, and producing sheets that could be written upon with brush and ink. Each of these ancient recording methods represented remarkable human ingenuity, yet all shared a common limitation. Every copy of every text had to be produced individually by hand. Whether pressing marks into clay, painting characters on papyrus, or inscribing words on parchment, the creation of written records remained an intensely labor-intensive process. Knowledge could be preserved, certainly, but its reproduction and distribution remained constrained by the time and skill required to copy each document. These constraints would shape human civilization for millennia, determining who had access to written knowledge and how quickly information could spread across distances. The world awaited a revolution in how text could be reproduced, though that transformation still lay centuries in the future. Across the vast expanse of Asia, while European monks labored in their quiet scriptoriums, an entirely different story of printing was unfolding. In the great empire of China, centuries before Gutenberg would even be born, inventors and craftsmen had already discovered methods to reproduce text that would have seemed like pure magic to medieval Europeans. During the Tang dynasty, in the 7th century of the Common Era, Chinese artisans developed a technique that would transform how knowledge could be preserved and shared. They carved entire pages of text in reverse onto smooth blocks of wood, creating raised characters that could be inked and pressed onto paper. The process required extraordinary skill and patience. A craftsman would take a wooden block, usually made from pear or jujube wood prized for its fine grain and durability, and painstakingly carve away everything except the characters themselves. Each stroke had to be precise, each character perfectly formed in mirror image. The results were remarkable. Once a block was carved, it could produce hundreds or even thousands of identical copies. Buddhist temples and monasteries quickly recognized the value of this technology for reproducing religious texts. The earliest known printed book still in existence today is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist scripture printed in 868 CE. This scroll, over 16 feet long, bears a date and a dedication, telling us it was made by a man named Wang Jie for his parents. The quality of the printing is stunning, with intricate illustrations accompanying the text, demonstrating that even in these early days, Chinese printers had mastered their craft with sophisticated precision. Woodblock printing spread throughout East Asia, reaching Korea and Japan, where it was embraced with equal enthusiasm. Entire libraries of Buddhist texts were printed, along with Confucian classics, poetry, and works of literature. The government used printing to produce paper money, creating standardized currency that helped unify economic systems across vast distances. By the time Europe was still laboriously copying manuscripts by hand, China had been printing books for centuries. But the Chinese innovations did not stop with woodblock printing. During the Song dynasty, around 1040 CE, a man named Bai Sheng took the concept even further. He created individual characters from ceramic clay, firing them to make them hard and durable. These separate pieces could be arranged in a frame to form any text, then disassembled and reused for different pages or different books entirely. This was movable type, the same fundamental principle that Gutenberg would later develop independently in Europe. Bai Sheng's method was ingenious in its simplicity. He would take his clay characters and arrange them on an iron plate covered with a mixture of resin, wax, and paper ash. Once the page was composed, he would heat the plate gently, just enough to soften the mixture and hold the characters firmly in place. After printing the desired number of copies, he would heat the plate again, allowing the characters to be easily removed and sorted back into their storage cases, ready to be used again. Later innovations refined this system further. Korean inventors created movable type from bronze in the 13th century, producing books with metal characters that were even more durable than ceramic ones. The oldest known book printed with metal movable type is the Jikji, a Korean Buddhist document from 1377, predating Gutenberg's famous Bible by nearly 80 years. Yet despite these remarkable achievements, movable type never achieved in East Asia what it would eventually accomplish in Europe. There were practical reasons for this. Chinese writing uses thousands of different characters, not a simple alphabet of a few dozen letters. A printer needed to maintain vast collections of characters, organizing and retrieving them efficiently. The complexity of the Chinese writing system meant that for many purposes, carving a single woodblock remained more practical than composing text from thousands of individual pieces. Cultural and economic factors played their role as well. Literacy in Imperial China was largely confined to the scholarly and official classes. While books were certainly valued and printing was an established craft, there was not the same explosive demand for texts that would later drive the printing revolution in Europe. The systems in place, though slower than what printing could theoretically achieve, adequately served the existing market. Geography and politics also limited the spread of these innovations. China's printing technology remained largely within East Asia, separated from Europe by vast distances and the formidable barriers of the Silk Road. While some knowledge certainly traveled along trade routes, the specific technical details of movable type did not make the complete journey westward. There is no clear evidence that Gutenberg knew of these earlier Chinese and Korean innovations when he began his own experiments. This geographical isolation meant that Europe would need to discover these principles independently. The technologies that Chinese inventors had perfected over centuries would need to be reinvented from the beginning, adapted to different writing systems, different languages, and different social conditions. As the centuries passed and Europe remained in its age of hand-copied manuscripts, the Chinese continued refining their printing methods. Books accumulated in imperial libraries. Buddhist monasteries printed sutras by the thousands. The technology was mature, established, and effective within its own context. Yet the transformation that printing would bring to Europe, the explosive democratization of knowledge that would reshape an entire civilization, did not occur in China in the same way. The invention existed, proven and practical, but the particular combination of circumstances that would make printing truly revolutionary still awaited the right moment, the right place, and the right person to bring them together. That moment would come in 15th century Germany, in a world hungry for books and ready for change. But the Chinese had already shown that the fundamental principles were sound, that metal and wood could preserve words and multiply them beyond the capacity of any scribe's pen. They had pioneered the path, even if they could not have known that thousands of miles away, their discoveries would one day be echoed in a workshop along the Rhine. As we leave behind the remarkable innovations of ancient China and turn our attention westward across the vast expanse of medieval Europe, we arrive in a different world entirely. Here, in the bustling commercial cities along the Rhine River, a child was born who would transform human civilization in ways that neither he nor anyone else could have imagined. The year was approximately 1400, though the exact date remains lost to history, as was common for births in that era. The place was Mainz, a prosperous city in what is now Germany, where merchants traded goods from across Europe and craftsmen practiced their specialized skills. The child's name was Johannes Gutenberg, though history would remember him simply as Johannes Gutenberg. His name itself tells us something about the world he came from. Gensfleisch was his father's family name, meaning goose flesh in German, while Gutenberg, meaning good mountain, came from the name of the house where his mother's family lived. In medieval Germany, people often took their names from their residences, and the young Johannes would eventually adopt Gutenberg as the name by which he would be known. His father, Friedrich Gensfleisch, held a position of some importance in Mainz society. He worked at the Episcopal Mint, the place where coins were produced under the authority of the local archbishop. This detail would prove more significant than it might first appear, for it meant that young Johannes grew up in a household familiar with the precise work of metalworking. The creation of coins required exacting standards, knowledge of metal alloys, and an understanding of how to create identical copies of a design over and over again. These were not abstract concepts in the Gutenberg household but part of daily conversation and lived experience. Mainz itself was a city that shaped the boy who would one day revolutionize the world. Situated on the Rhine River, it served as an important center of trade and commerce. Boats traveled up and down the waterway, carrying goods and news from distant places. The city had a cosmopolitan quality, with merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and nobles all contributing to its vibrant life. The Archbishop of Mainz wielded considerable political and religious authority, and the city reflected the complex interweaving of sacred and secular power that characterized medieval European society. We know relatively little about Gutenberg's childhood and youth, as detailed records of such personal matters rarely survived from this period. He would have received an education appropriate to his family's social standing, learning to read and write in Latin, the language of learning and the church. He would have attended religious services regularly, experiencing the rituals and texts of Catholic Christianity that permeated every aspect of medieval life. The grand churches of Mainz, with their soaring architecture and elaborate ceremonies, would have been familiar spaces to the young Gutenberg. As a boy, Johannes likely watched craftsmen at work in the streets and workshops of Mainz. The medieval city was a place where production happened visibly, not hidden away in distant factories. Goldsmiths bent over their benches, carefully shaping precious metals. Blacksmiths hammered at their forges. Woodworkers carved intricate designs. Painters mixed their colors. Each craft had its secrets, its accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of apprentices learning from masters. This world of skilled handwork would have surrounded young Gutenberg, showing him what patient craftsmanship could achieve. The early 15th century was a time of change and uncertainty in Europe. Gutenberg was born into a world still recovering from the Black Death, which had killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population in the previous century. Cities had begun to grow again, trade was expanding, and a wealthy merchant class was emerging alongside the traditional nobility. Yet this was also a time of conflict and tension, with wars between rival princes, disputes between cities and nobles, and ongoing struggles over power and authority. In Mainz itself, tensions between different social groups would eventually affect Gutenberg's family directly. The patrician families, including the Gutenbergs, found themselves in conflict with the craft guilds that sought greater political power. This struggle came to a head when Johannes was still young, and his family was forced to leave Mainz, probably sometime in the 1420s. They relocated to Eltville, a smaller town not far away, where they had connections and property. This period of displacement may have been formative for young Gutenberg. Experiencing his family's loss of status and the need to rebuild their position may have given him insight into the precariousness of fortune and the value of practical skills that could not be taken away. It certainly would have shown him that the world could change, that established orders could be disrupted, and that adaptability mattered. What we can say with certainty is that Johannes Gutenberg received training as a goldsmith, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. This was one of the most prestigious crafts, requiring years of apprenticeship to master. A goldsmith needed to understand metals intimately, how different alloys behaved, how to cast and shape them, how to create fine details and smooth finishes. The work demanded precision, patience, and an almost scientific understanding of materials. These skills would prove essential to Gutenberg's later achievements, though he could not have known this as he learned to work gold and silver in his youth. The craft of goldsmithing also involved creating small, detailed objects that required careful planning and execution. A goldsmith might create intricate jewelry, religious objects for churches, or decorative items for wealthy patrons. Each piece required thought about how to translate a design into physical form, how to solve technical problems, and how to achieve both beauty and durability. These were exactly the kinds of challenges that Gutenberg would later face in a very different context. As young Johannes learned his craft and grew to manhood, he was also absorbing the culture of his time. He lived in a world where books were precious rarities, where knowledge was controlled by institutions, where the written word carried immense authority precisely because it was so scarce. He would have seen manuscripts in churches and perhaps in the homes of wealthy patrons, understanding their value and their limitations. Every book he encountered had been copied by hand, each one unique, each one expensive beyond the means of ordinary people. The young man coming of age in this world could not have predicted the future, but the experiences of his early years were preparing him in ways both obvious and subtle. The metalworking skills learned from his father's profession and his own training, the understanding of commerce and craft from growing up in mines, the disruption of his family's exile, and the broader cultural context of a society hungry for knowledge but limited by the technology available to share it, all these elements were quietly coming together. Johannes Gutenberg was ready to begin the journey that would lead him to change the world, though the path ahead remained unclear and the challenges would prove immense. In the workshops and guilds of medieval Germany, gold was more than a precious metal. It was a medium of artistry, a challenge to master, and a language spoken through the careful manipulation of fire, hammer, and precision tools. Johannes Gutenberg entered this world of goldsmithing as a young man, and the skills he acquired there would become the foundation of his revolutionary invention, though he could not have known it at the time. The work of a goldsmith in the early 15th century demanded extraordinary patience and attention to detail. Every piece began with understanding the metal itself, how gold responded to heat, how it could be drawn into wire or hammered into sheets thinner than parchment. Gutenberg learned to read the colors of heated metal, knowing when the temperature reached exactly the right moment for shaping. Too hot, and the metal became unworkable. Too cool, and it would crack under the hammer's persuasion. Beyond gold, a master craftsman needed to understand the properties of many metals and their alloys. Silver behaved differently than gold, requiring different temperatures and techniques. Copper added strength when combined with other metals, changing their characteristics in precise, predictable ways. This knowledge of metallurgy was not written in books or taught in universities. It passed from master to apprentice through years of observation, practice, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. The goldsmith's bench held tools that would seem delicate to anyone unfamiliar with the trade. Fine files for smoothing surfaces, engraving tools for creating intricate patterns, punches for stamping designs into metal. Each tool served a specific purpose, and learning to use them properly took years of dedicated practice. The hands had to develop a sense of touch so refined that minute imperfections could be detected by feel alone. The eyes had to learn to see flaws invisible to untrained observers. Gutenberg's family connection to the mines mint proved particularly valuable during his training. Working with coinage required precision of a special kind. Each coin needed to be exactly the right weight, the right composition of metals, and bear clear, consistent markings. The dies used to stamp coins were miniature works of art, carved in reverse so they would print correctly on the metal blanks. These dies had to withstand tremendous pressure, striking coin after coin without degrading or losing their sharp detail. Creating these dies taught lessons about durability and replication that few other crafts could provide. A die maker learned to think in reverse, to carve letters and images as mirror reflections of themselves. He learned which alloys could withstand thousands of impacts without wearing down. He discovered how to create identical impressions over and over, maintaining consistent quality through countless repetitions. The process of casting metal into precise forms required its own specialized knowledge. A goldsmith might need to create multiple copies of decorative elements or repair damaged pieces by casting replacements. This involved making molds, often from materials like clay or sand, and understanding how molten metal would flow into them. Different metals shrank by different amounts as they cooled, so the mold had to be sized accordingly. Air bubbles could ruin a casting, creating weaknesses in the finished piece. Temperature, timing, and technique all had to align perfectly. Working with such precision demanded absolute cleanliness and organization. A speck of dirt in molten metal could create a flaw. Tools had to be maintained in perfect condition, their edges sharp and true. The workspace itself became an extension of the craftsman's skill, everything arranged for maximum efficiency and precision. Gutenberg learned to work methodically, to plan each step before beginning, to anticipate problems before they occurred. The goldsmith's craft also required an understanding of chemistry, though that word would not have been used in Gutenberg's time. Creating different alloys meant knowing which metals would combine successfully and which would resist mixing. Surface treatments could change the appearance of metal, creating different colors and finishes. Some substances would etch metal, eating into its surface in controlled ways. Others would prevent corrosion or alter how the metal accepted other materials. Perhaps most importantly for what would come later, Gutenberg learned the patience required for exacting work. A goldsmith might spend days or weeks on a single piece, knowing that one careless moment could ruin hours of careful labor. This temperament, this ability to persist through countless small setbacks and technical challenges, became essential when Gutenberg later faced the seemingly impossible task of creating a printing system. The medieval goldsmith occupied a respected position in urban society. These craftsmen created not only jewelry and decorative objects but also religious items for churches, official seals for governments, and precious objects for wealthy patrons. The work required trustworthiness since goldsmiths handled valuable materials. It demanded business skills, as craftsmen needed to negotiate prices, manage workshops, and sometimes employ apprentices and journeymen. Gutenberg learned these aspects of the trade alongside the technical skills. During his years as a goldsmith, Gutenberg would have observed how information and technique spread through craft guilds. Skilled workers sometimes traveled between cities, bringing new methods and ideas with them. Trade fairs and markets created opportunities for craftsmen to see each other's work and exchange knowledge. Yet much expertise remained closely guarded, passed only to trusted apprentices who had proven themselves over years of service. This tension between secrecy and sharing would later influence how Gutenberg approached his printing experiments. The tools of metalworking connected Gutenberg to a long tradition of human ingenuity. The techniques he mastered had evolved over centuries, refined by countless craftsmen seeking better ways to shape and manipulate metal. Standing at his bench, working with fire and hammer and precision tools, Gutenberg joined this tradition while simultaneously developing the skills that would allow him to transcend it. As he completed his training and established himself as a master craftsman, Gutenberg possessed knowledge that few others could claim. He understood metals at a fundamental level, knew how to create durable alloys, could cast precise forms repeatedly, and had developed the patience and precision required for exacting work. He could think in terms of creating multiple identical pieces and understood the engineering principles behind presses and dies. All these skills, acquired slowly through years of dedicated practice, would soon come together in ways that no goldsmith before him could have imagined. The gentle glow of the goldsmith's forge, the quiet concentration of detailed work, the satisfaction of solving technical challenges through skill and persistence, these experiences shaped Gutenberg's approach to problems. They gave him confidence that difficult technical challenges could be overcome through careful thought and persistent experimentation. The workshop where he learned his craft was far removed from the scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts, yet the connection between these worlds would soon become clear. Gutenberg stood at a unique moment in history, when circumstance and need aligned like the gears of a well-crafted timepiece. His skills as a metalworker had given him the tools to create something remarkable, but it was the world around him that presented the problem crying out for solution. In the bustling cities and quiet monasteries of 15th century Europe, a hunger for the written word grew stronger with each passing year, yet the means of satisfying that hunger remained frustratingly inadequate. The demand for books had been building for generations, driven by forces both sacred and secular. Universities had spread across the continent, from Oxford to Paris to Bologna, and these centers of learning required texts in quantities that scribes could barely supply. Students needed copies of Aristotle, of medical treatises, of law codes, and theological commentaries. Professors lectured from rare volumes that might be the only copy available for hundreds of miles. When a university managed to acquire an important text, scribes would work frantically to produce additional copies, but the process remained agonizingly slow and expensive. The church itself represented perhaps the greatest source of demand for books. Every parish needed service books for conducting mass. Monasteries required copies of the Bible, psalters for daily prayers, and the writings of church fathers. Wealthy patrons commissioned elaborate books of hours for private devotion, each one a laboriously hand-copied manuscript that might take a skilled scribe months to complete. The appetite for religious texts seemed limitless, yet the capacity to produce them remained severely constrained by the old methods of copying by hand. Beyond the universities and churches, a growing merchant class was discovering the value of literacy and learning. These prosperous traders and craftspeople had money to spend and increasingly sought to educate themselves and their children. They wanted books not just for devotion but for practical knowledge, for entertainment, for the prestige that came with owning volumes. In the thriving commercial cities of the Rhineland where Gutenberg lived and worked, this new class of potential readers represented an enormous untapped market. The problem was simple to state but had proven maddeningly difficult to solve. Books took too long to produce and cost far too much. A single manuscript Bible might represent a year of labor by a skilled scribe, plus the cost of parchment made from the skins of hundreds of animals. The result was that books remained luxury items, accessible only to institutions and the wealthy. A working craftsman might earn a decent living but could never hope to own more than perhaps 1 or 2 books in a lifetime, if any at all. Gutenberg understood these economics intimately. His own background in the metalworking trades had taught him about markets and demand, about the relationship between production methods and pricing. He could see clearly that if someone could find a way to produce books more quickly and cheaply, the potential market was vast. Every university, every monastery, every parish church, and increasingly, individual readers of means, all represented potential customers for affordable books. The timing made Gutenberg's moment in history particularly significant. Paper had become more readily available in Europe through trade networks extending to the Islamic world and beyond. Paper cost far less than parchment and could be produced in much larger quantities. This development meant that at least one major component of book production, the material to print on, had become more accessible. But without a way to speed up the actual creation of text, paper alone couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Religious fervor across Europe intensified the desire for biblical texts. People wanted to own scriptures, to read holy words for themselves rather than relying entirely on priests and intermediaries. The late medieval period saw waves of religious enthusiasm, new devotional movements, and increased lay piety. All of this created pressure for more books, particularly Bibles and devotional texts, in quantities that hand copying simply could not meet. Gutenberg also lived in a time when knowledge itself was becoming increasingly valued and sought after. The Renaissance was beginning to flower in Italy, bringing renewed interest in classical texts and learning. Scholars searched for ancient manuscripts, comparing versions, seeking the most accurate texts of Greek and Roman authors. This scholarly activity created yet another source of demand for books, another reason why better methods of reproduction were desperately needed. The economic potential of solving this problem was clear to anyone who thought carefully about it. A craftsman who could produce books quickly and cheaply would find customers eager for his wares. The risk lay in the immense challenge of developing such a method and the substantial investment required to perfect the technology before any return could be realized. Many people recognized the need, but few had the combination of technical skill, creative vision, and determination required to pursue a solution. As Gutenberg contemplated these circumstances, he could see both opportunity and challenge. His metalworking expertise gave him insights that most scribes and scholars lacked. He understood casting and molds, he knew how metals behaved, he had the precision skills needed for intricate work. The question forming in his mind was whether these skills, applied in novel ways, might offer a path forward. The social structure of his time also played a role in making innovation possible. Gutenberg lived in a society of guilds and craftspeople, where technical knowledge was valued and where a skilled artisan could hope to profit from his innovations. Though he would need financial backing to pursue his ideas, the commercial networks and investment structures existed to make such partnerships possible, however risky they might be. All around Gutenberg, the signs pointed to a world ready for change, waiting for someone to bridge the gap between the need for books and the capacity to produce them. The universities continued to grow. The merchant class continued to expand. The church's appetite for texts remained insatiable. And increasingly, individuals across society were discovering that they too wanted access to the written word, to knowledge and stories and ideas preserved on the page. In quiet moments in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his metalworking trade, Gutenberg must have felt the weight and possibility of the challenge before him. The problem was clear, the demand was evident, and his unique skills offered a potential path to solution. What remained was the long, difficult work of turning possibility into reality, of transforming an idea into a functioning technology that could change the world. The recognition of a problem is only the first step toward innovation. For Johannes Gutenberg, understanding that the world hungered for books, that monasteries and universities struggled to meet the demand for texts, that merchants and wealthy families sought volumes they could rarely obtain, this knowledge was merely the beginning. What followed were years of quiet, determined experimentation, a period in which an idea gradually transformed from philosophical speculation into mechanical reality. Around 1430, Gutenberg left his native mines, traveling upstream along the Rhine to the city of Strasbourg. The reasons for his departure remain somewhat mysterious, though records suggest political tensions and guild conflicts may have played a role. What we know with certainty is that he would spend the better part of 2 decades in this prosperous trading city, and it was here, away from the watchful eyes of his hometown, that his revolutionary concept began to take concrete form. Strasbourg offered Gutenberg something invaluable, space to think and experiment without constant scrutiny. The city thrived as a center of commerce and craftsmanship, home to skilled metalworkers, goldsmiths, and various artisans whose expertise Gutenberg could observe and occasionally consult. In this environment, surrounded by the sounds of hammers on anvils and the sight of careful hands shaping precious metals, Gutenberg began his quiet work. The surviving legal documents from this period provide tantalizing glimpses into Gutenberg's activities. Court records from 1439 reveal that he had entered into a partnership with several local men, Andreas Dritzhn, Andreas Heilmann, and Hans Reif. They had invested money in what Gutenberg called his secret enterprise, expecting to learn his techniques and share in the profits. The documents carefully avoid revealing the exact nature of this work, referring only to mysterious arts and secret knowledge. When Andreas Dritzhn died unexpectedly, his heirs attempted to claim his share of the partnership, leading to a legal dispute that fortunately preserved these fragmentary records for historians. What exactly was Gutenberg working on during these Strasbourg years? The evidence suggests he was experimenting with various projects, possibly including the production of small mirrors for pilgrims, a profitable trade item of the time. But behind these ventures, he was pursuing something far more ambitious. Witnesses in the legal proceedings mention seeing a press, lead, and forms, intriguing references that hint at printing experiments already underway. The challenge Gutenberg faced was fundamentally different from any encountered by previous craftsmen. Woodblock printing, as practiced in China and occasionally in Europe for simple images or playing cards, required carving an entire page in reverse into a single block of wood. This method worked for texts that would be printed many times without change, but it offered no flexibility and required enormous skill and time for each new page. Gutenberg envisioned something entirely different, a system where individual letters could be arranged in any order, used to print a page, then broken apart and rearranged into completely different text. The concept itself was elegant in its simplicity. Create individual letters, each identical to its fellows, and arrange them like small building blocks to form words, sentences, pages. Print the page, then disassemble and reconfigure the letters for the next page. The genius lay not in the idea itself. Others had likely imagined similar systems, but in solving the countless practical problems that stood between imagination and reality. How could one create hundreds or thousands of identical letters, each precisely the same height and size, each capable of withstanding the pressure of printing? How could these letters be arranged securely so they wouldn't shift during printing? What kind of ink would transfer cleanly from metal to paper? How could pressure be applied evenly across an entire page? Each question led to a dozen more, and each answer required experimentation, failure, adjustment, and trying again. Gutenberg approached these challenges with the patience of a craftsman and the precision of a goldsmith. He knew metals intimately, understood their properties, their strengths and limitations. He knew how different alloys behaved when cast, how they wore under pressure, how they could be shaped and finished. This knowledge, accumulated through years of working with precious metals, now found application in an entirely new context. During his Strasbourg period, Gutenberg lived modestly, investing what resources he had into his experiments. He borrowed money, formed partnerships, and maintained careful secrecy about his methods. The discretion wasn't merely about protecting potential profits, though that certainly mattered, but reflected the uncertain nature of his work. Why raise expectations about something that might never succeed? Why invite skepticism or interference when the path forward remained unclear? The years passed slowly, marked by incremental progress rather than sudden breakthroughs. Gutenberg tested different metal compositions, experimented with various techniques for creating individual letters, and explored ways to hold these letters in place. He studied the properties of different inks, observing how they behaved on metal surfaces. He examined paper, which by this time was being manufactured in Europe through techniques learned from Islamic papermakers, considering how it might receive impression from ink type. We can imagine him in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, working by candlelight as evening settled over Strasbourg. The streets outside grew quiet while inside, Gutenberg arranged and rearranged small pieces of metal, pressed them against paper, studied the results, and made careful notes about what worked and what failed. This was not the dramatic, inspired invention of legend but the patient, methodical work of a craftsman determined to solve a complex puzzle. By the time Gutenberg prepared to leave Strasbourg in the late 1440s, his concept had evolved from vague possibility to practical proposition. He hadn't yet perfected every element of his system, but he understood the fundamental principles. He knew what needed to be accomplished, even if some details remained to be refined. The pieces were coming together, slowly forming themselves into a coherent whole. The move back to mines around 1448 or 1449 marked a new phase in Gutenberg's journey. He returned to his hometown no longer merely as a goldsmith with unusual ideas but as an inventor with a developing technology that required significant resources to bring to completion. The experimentation would continue, but now with greater focus and urgency. The conceptual phase was ending. The time for practical implementation was beginning. Having settled on his vision of individual metal letters that could be assembled into pages, Gutenberg now faced the daunting reality of transforming concept into working technology. The idea itself was elegant in its simplicity, but between imagination and execution lay a treacherous landscape of technical obstacles, each one threatening to unravel his entire enterprise. In the quiet workshops where he labored, often working late into the night by candlelight, Gutenberg confronted challenges that would have discouraged a less determined inventor. The first and perhaps most fundamental problem concerned the letters themselves. Each character needed to be identical to every other version of that same letter. When a page required multiple instances of the letter E or A, readers should notice no difference between them. This consistency was not merely aesthetic but essential for legibility and professional appearance. The letters needed to align perfectly in rows, standing at exactly the same height, with each one fitting snugly against its neighbors without gaps or overlap. Even the slightest variation would create an uneven, unprofessional appearance that would betray the mechanical nature of the process. Beyond mere uniformity, each letter had to be remarkably durable. Gutenberg envisioned these metal characters being used repeatedly, perhaps thousands of times, pressed against paper with considerable force. A soft metal would deform or wear down quickly, becoming useless after just a few impressions. Yet the metal also needed to be workable enough that he could cast it with precision. Finding the right material became an obsession, requiring knowledge of metallurgy that went beyond what most craftsmen of his era possessed. The challenge of creating the letters in sufficient quantity posed yet another hurdle. A complete font required not just the 26 letters of the alphabet in both uppercase and lowercase forms, but also numerous punctuation marks, ligatures where two letters joined together, and various special characters. Gutenberg calculated that he needed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual pieces of type. Each one had to be produced quickly enough to make the entire venture practical, yet carefully enough to maintain that crucial consistency. Then there was the matter of ink. The water-based inks that scribes had used for centuries worked beautifully on parchment or paper when applied by hand with a quill or brush. These inks soaked into the writing surface, becoming part of the material itself. But Gutenberg's metal type presented an entirely different surface. Water-based ink simply beaded up on the metal, refusing to adhere properly. Even if he could coax the ink onto the letters, it wouldn't transfer evenly to paper under pressure. The resulting prints would be blotchy, faint, or illegible. He needed an entirely new formulation, something that would stick to metal yet transfer cleanly to paper, producing crisp, dark letters that wouldn't smudge or fade. The pressing mechanism itself demanded careful consideration. Gutenberg needed to apply firm, even pressure across an entire page of text, ensuring that every letter made contact with the paper with exactly the same force. Too little pressure would result in faint, incomplete impressions. Too much would damage the paper or cause the ink to spread beyond the boundaries of each letter, creating muddy, illegible text. The pressure had to be uniform across the entire sheet, from the center to the corners and edges, which required careful engineering of the pressing surface and the mechanism that drove it. Paper presented its own complications. While paper had become more available in Europe through trade and the establishment of paper mills, its quality varied considerably. Some papers were too thin and would tear under the pressure of printing. Others were too thick or had an inconsistent surface that wouldn't accept ink evenly. Gutenberg needed to identify or help develop paper that would work reliably with his process, accepting ink without bleeding or feathering, yet strong enough to withstand the mechanical pressure of printing. The workspace itself required careful organization. Gutenberg had to develop a systematic approach to arranging letters into words, words into lines, and lines into pages. The letters needed to be stored in a way that allowed quick access, sorted by character so that compositors could rapidly assemble text. Once arranged into a page, the entire block of text had to remain stable during the inking and pressing process, with no letters shifting or falling out of position. This demanded the creation of frames and spacing materials that would hold everything securely yet allow for easy disassembly after printing so the type could be reused. Timing and coordination posed practical challenges as well. The ink needed to be the right consistency, neither so thick that it wouldn't spread evenly across the type nor so thin that it would run and blur. It had to be applied uniformly across all the raised letters while avoiding the recessed spaces between them. The paper needed to be positioned precisely on the type, pressed at just the right moment while the ink remained wet enough to transfer but not so wet that it smeared, then removed carefully to avoid smudging the fresh impression. Cost considerations weighed heavily on every decision. Each experiment consumed materials and time, both of which required money that Gutenberg had borrowed or secured from investors. Every failed attempt, every material that proved unsuitable, every design that didn't work as intended represented not just technical disappointment but financial pressure. He had to balance the pursuit of quality and reliability against the practical necessity of producing results before his funding ran out or his creditors lost patience. Temperature and humidity affected different aspects of the process in ways that Gutenberg had to learn through experience. Metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes, potentially affecting the fit of letters in their frames. Ink behaved differently in warm and cold conditions. Paper absorbed moisture from the air, changing its texture and how it accepted ink. These environmental factors meant that techniques that worked well in one season might require adjustment in another. Through all these challenges, Gutenberg maintained his focus on the ultimate goal, producing printed pages that could rival or even surpass the quality of the finest hand-copied manuscripts. He understood that if his printed books looked crude or obviously mechanical, they would fail to find buyers among the discerning customers who could afford books. His invention had to be not merely functional but capable of producing beautiful results that readers would treasure. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Gutenberg systematically addressed each obstacle, bringing to bear his metalworking expertise, his careful observation, and his willingness to experiment until he found solutions. The technical challenges that filled his days and occupied his thoughts were gradually yielding to innovation and persistence, bringing him closer to the breakthrough that would transform his vision into reality. After years of grappling with the various elements needed for practical printing, Gutenberg arrived at the heart of his innovation, the individual metal letter. This single breakthrough would prove more revolutionary than any other aspect of his invention, for it solved the fundamental challenge that had prevented others from achieving true mass production of texts. The concept itself was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than carving an entire page of text into a single wooden block, as Chinese and Korean printers had done for centuries, Gutenberg envisioned creating thousands of individual letters, each one identical to its counterparts. These letters could be arranged into words, lines, and pages, then disassembled and rearranged into entirely different texts. The same letter, E might appear in 100 different places on a single page, yet each impression would be created by a different physical piece of metal. The challenge lay in the execution. Each letter needed to be precisely the same height, so that when pressed against paper, every character would print with equal clarity and pressure. The letters needed to be durable enough to withstand thousands of impressions without wearing down or breaking. They needed to be cast quickly and economically, or the entire enterprise would become too expensive to sustain. And they needed to fit together seamlessly, allowing no gaps or misalignments that would mar the printed page. Gutenberg's background as a goldsmith and metalworker now proved invaluable. He understood metals in ways that few of his contemporaries could match. He knew how different elements behaved when heated and cooled, how they flowed into molds, how they hardened and aged. This knowledge became the foundation for his most crucial innovation, the lead alloy that would form his type. Pure lead, while easy to cast, was too soft for printing. It would deform under pressure and wear down quickly. Pure tin was harder but more expensive and difficult to work with. Gutenberg experimented with various combinations until he discovered the ideal mixture, approximately 80% lead, 5% tin, and 15% antimony. This particular alloy possessed remarkable properties. It expanded slightly as it cooled, ensuring that every detail of the mold would be captured with perfect precision. It was hard enough to endure thousands of impressions yet soft enough to cast efficiently. It melted at a relatively low temperature, making it practical to work within a workshop setting. But creating the right alloy was only the beginning. Gutenberg needed a way to produce hundreds of identical copies of each letter quickly and accurately. His solution was the hand mold, a device so ingenious that its basic design would remain virtually unchanged for 4 centuries. The hand mold consisted of two L-shaped pieces of metal that fit together to form a rectangular cavity. At the bottom of this cavity sat a matrix, a small piece of copper into which the shape of a single letter had been carefully punched. When the two halves of the mold were closed and molten metal poured in from above, the metal would flow into the cavity and take on the reverse shape of the letter stamped in the matrix below. Creating the matrices themselves required extraordinary precision. Gutenberg likely began by carving each letter in relief on the end of a steel punch. This punch was then struck into a softer copper blank, creating an indented impression of the letter. Each matrix had to be absolutely precise, for any flaw would be reproduced in every piece of typecast from it. The depth had to be consistent, the angles exact, the details crisp and clear. With his mold and matrices prepared, Gutenberg could produce type with remarkable speed and consistency. A skilled craftsman could cast several hundred letters in a single day. The mold opened and closed easily, the metal cooled within seconds, and each new piece of type tumbled out ready for use after a quick trimming of excess metal. The genius of this system became apparent in its flexibility and efficiency. Gutenberg needed to create matrices for every letter of the alphabet in both uppercase and lowercase forms, plus numbers, punctuation marks, and the numerous abbreviations and ligatures common in medieval writing. For his famous Bible, he created approximately 300 different characters to replicate the appearance of fine manuscript writing. Yet once these matrices were made, he could produce as many copies of each letter as his work required. Consider the letter E, the most common letter in Latin and German texts. A single page of type might require 50 or more copies of this letter. A complete Bible would need tens of thousands. With the hand mold and matrix system, producing these thousands of identical letters became a manageable task rather than an impossible dream. The physical characteristics of the type itself reflected Gutenberg's careful thinking. Each piece was slightly tapered, wider at the face than at the foot, making it easier to slide letters together tightly and ensuring they would grip firmly when locked into the form. The height of every piece had to be identical, a specification that printers would later call type high. This uniformity meant that when a page of type was inked and pressed, every letter would make contact with the paper with equal force. The weight and feel of these metal letters satisfied in their solidity. Unlike wooden blocks that might warp or crack, unlike clay tablets that could crumble, these metal characters possessed a permanence and reliability that suited the task perfectly. A printer could set them, print from them, distribute them back into their cases, and use them again and again. A well-cast piece of type might produce 10,000 impressions before showing significant wear. Gutenberg's workshop must have contained thousands upon thousands of these individual letters, organized in cases with compartments for each character. The most frequently used letters occupied the most accessible positions, while rare characters resided in less convenient spots. This organization system, developed in those early days of printing, would evolve into the arrangement still known as the uppercase and lowercase drawers, terms that persist even in our digital age. The metallurgical precision required for this innovation cannot be overstated. The alloy had to be formulated exactly right. The molds had to be manufactured to exacting tolerances. The matrices had to be perfect. Any variation, any inconsistency, any flaw would multiply across thousands of letters and ruin the final printed page. That Gutenberg achieved this level of precision in the 15th century, without modern measuring instruments or quality control systems, stands as a testament to his skill and determination. This system of movable metal type represented more than a technical achievement. It embodied a new way of thinking about the production of texts, breaking down the continuous flow of writing into discrete, reusable units. It transformed the creation of books from an art into a mechanical process, from something unique into something reproducible, from something rare into something that could, potentially, become commonplace. With his type perfected, Gutenberg had solved the central puzzle. Now he needed to turn his attention to the mechanism that would bring these metal letters into contact with paper, applying precisely the right amount of pressure to create clear, consistent impressions page after page. With his revolutionary movable type perfected, Gutenberg faced another fundamental challenge. The individual metal letters were only part of the solution. To transfer ink from those precisely crafted characters onto paper required a mechanism capable of applying firm, even pressure across an entire page. The answer lay not in inventing something entirely new, but in recognizing the potential of a familiar technology that surrounded him in the Rhine Valley. The wine press had been a common sight throughout the German countryside for centuries. In a region where viticulture sustained entire communities, these sturdy wooden mechanisms turned grapes into wine through simple but effective application of pressure. A large wooden screw, turned by a horizontal bar, gradually lowered a heavy wooden plate onto the grapes below, extracting their juice through sustained, uniform force. Gutenberg observed these presses with the eye of someone searching for solutions, and he saw beyond their agricultural purpose to their mechanical potential. The adaptation required careful thought. A wine press operated vertically, bringing pressure down from above, which aligned perfectly with the needs of printing. The composed page of metal type would rest on a flat surface, the paper would be laid upon it, and pressure applied from above would transfer the ink. But wine presses were designed for crushing soft organic matter, not for the delicate precision required to press paper against metal type. Gutenberg needed to modify the concept significantly while preserving its essential mechanical advantage. The press Gutenberg developed featured a sturdy wooden frame, typically constructed from hardwood strong enough to withstand repeated use. This frame had to be absolutely stable, as any movement or flexing would result in uneven pressure and poor print quality. The vertical screw mechanism, borrowed from the wine press design, descended through the upper portion of the frame. Unlike the wine press, however, Gutenberg's adaptation required finer control and more precise alignment. The flat bed of the press, called the platen, held the composed type. This surface needed to be perfectly level, as even slight variations would cause some letters to print darker than others or fail to print at all. Gutenberg's metalworking expertise proved invaluable here, as he understood how to create and maintain flat, true surfaces. The type was locked into a rectangular metal frame called a chase, which held all the individual letters firmly in position during printing. Above this bed, the press featured a flat plate that would descend to apply pressure. This plate, also called a platen, had to distribute force evenly across the entire printing surface. The screw mechanism allowed the printer to control precisely how much pressure was applied and to raise and lower the plate smoothly. Between impressions, the plate would be raised, allowing the printer to remove the printed sheet and position a fresh piece of paper. The mechanical advantage of the screw design meant that a printer could generate tremendous pressure through relatively modest physical effort. By turning the horizontal bar attached to the vertical screw, the operator converted rotational motion into powerful downward force. This pressure needed to be substantial enough to ensure good contact between paper and ink type, yet controlled enough not to damage the delicate paper or distort the metal letters. Gutenberg incorporated several refinements that distinguished his press from its winemaking ancestor. The speed of operation mattered greatly for commercial viability. A wine press could work slowly, as the grapes had nowhere to go and time itself aided extraction. A printing press, however, needed to produce pages efficiently. Gutenberg designed his mechanism to allow relatively quick raising and lowering of the platen, enabling a skilled printer to produce multiple impressions per hour. The press also included a sliding bed mechanism. Rather than requiring the printer to reach deep into the press to position paper, the type bed could slide in and out on rails. This innovation served multiple purposes. It allowed the printer to ink the type outside the press, ensuring even coverage without the awkwardness of working within the frame. It also made positioning the paper easier and more accurate, reducing waste from misaligned impressions. The actual printing process, facilitated by this adapted mechanism, followed a rhythmic sequence. The printer would slide the bed out, applying to the type using leather-covered balls, position the paper carefully, then slide the bed back under the platen. Pulling the bar would rotate the screw, lowering the plate to press paper against type. After a moment of sustained pressure, the printer would reverse the process, raising the platen, sliding out the bed, and carefully removing the printed sheet to dry. This mechanical simplicity proved to be one of the press's great strengths. The design had few moving parts, all of them robust and maintainable. A printer could understand the mechanism completely and repair it with basic woodworking and metalworking skills. Unlike more complex machinery, the press was unlikely to break down at critical moments, and when problems did occur, solutions were usually straightforward. The pressing mechanism also allowed for remarkable consistency. Once a printer determined the correct amount of pressure for a particular paper and ink combination, that setting could be replicated impression after impression. This consistency meant that page 100 looked virtually identical to page 1, maintaining quality throughout an entire print run. Such uniformity had been impossible with hand copying, where fatigue, changing conditions, and human variation inevitably affected the work. The size of Gutenberg's press, while substantial, remained manageable. The entire apparatus stood perhaps 6 or 7 feet tall and occupied a workspace roughly 3 feet square. This meant that multiple presses could operate in a single workshop, with different texts being produced simultaneously. The press was also sturdy enough to withstand years of use, with some early presses continuing to function for decades after their construction. The wine press adaptation represented an elegant solution, taking proven technology and applying it to an entirely new purpose. Gutenberg recognized that innovation often involves seeing familiar objects with fresh eyes, understanding their underlying principles rather than their surface purposes. The pressing mechanism that extracted juice from grapes could, with thoughtful modification, transfer ink from metal to paper with equal effectiveness. As Gutenberg refined his press design, he created something that would be recognizable to printers for centuries to come. The basic configuration he established became the standard, with subsequent improvements representing refinements rather than fundamental redesigns. The adaptation of the wine press to printing purposes stands as a testament to practical engineering, demonstrating how observation, mechanical understanding, and creative problem-solving could transform an existing technology into something revolutionary. With his press mechanism perfected and his metal type cast in precise rows within their wooden cases, Gutenberg faced 2 more challenges that would determine whether his invention could succeed. The metal letters and the wooden press were nothing without the right medium to bind them together. He needed an ink that would perform unlike any ink that had come before, and he needed a surface to receive that ink reliably, page after page, copy after copy. The inks used by scribes in monastery scriptoriums throughout medieval Europe had served their purpose admirably for centuries. These traditional inks were water-based, made from various recipes that monastic communities guarded and refined over generations. The most common writing ink was created from iron salts and the galls that formed on oak trees when certain wasps laid their eggs in the bark. These oak galls, when crushed and mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic, produced a dark fluid that flowed smoothly from a quill pen and bonded well with parchment or paper. But what worked beautifully for hand copying would not work for Gutenberg's mechanical process. Water-based ink, when applied to metal type, refused to adhere properly to the surface. It beaded up, ran in unwanted directions, and produced blotchy, uneven results when pressed onto paper. The metal type and the traditional ink seemed to repel one another, and no amount of careful application could overcome this fundamental incompatibility. Gutenberg understood that he needed something entirely different. His background as a metalworker gave him insight into the properties of various substances, and he began experimenting with wool-based formulations. This was a significant departure from centuries of ink-making tradition, and it required thinking about the problem in a completely new way. The base for his new ink came from linseed oil, derived from flax seeds. Linseed oil had been used by painters for mixing pigments, and it had properties that made it suitable for Gutenberg's purposes. But the oil in its raw state was too thin and slow drying. Gutenberg needed to modify it, to thicken it into a consistency that would coat metal evenly, transfer cleanly to paper under pressure, and dry quickly enough to allow practical production. He heated the linseed oil, carefully controlling the temperature and timing to achieve the right thickness. This process, known as boiling or cooking the oil, caused chemical changes that increased its viscosity and improved its drying properties. The exact details of Gutenberg's formula have been lost to history, but analysis of surviving printed pages from his era reveals what ingredients he likely used. For pigment, Gutenberg turned to lampblack, the fine carbon soot collected from oil lamps. This material had been used in various inks for centuries, prized for producing a deep, rich black color. He mixed the lampblack with his treated linseed oil, grinding the mixture thoroughly to ensure even distribution of the pigment throughout the oil base. The resulting ink was thick, almost paste-like, quite different from anything scribes had used before. This oil-based ink possessed remarkable qualities for printing. It adhered beautifully to metal type, coating each letter evenly when applied with leather-covered dabbers. When the ink type was pressed against paper, the ink transferred completely and crisply, leaving sharp, dark impressions that captured every detail of the metal letters. And crucially, it dried relatively quickly, allowing printed pages to be handled and stacked without smearing. The development of this ink was as important to the success of printing as the press itself or the movable type. Without it, Gutenberg's mechanical system would have produced only disappointing, illegible results. With it, he could create pages that rivaled or even surpassed the visual quality of hand-copied manuscripts. But ink alone was not sufficient. Gutenberg also needed the right surface to print upon, and here he benefited from changes that had occurred in Europe over the preceding 2 centuries. For most of the medieval period, important texts had been copied onto parchment, the treated skins of sheep, goats, or calves. Parchment was durable and beautiful, but it was also expensive and time-consuming to produce. A single Bible required the skins of hundreds of animals, representing enormous cost. Paper offered an alternative. Invented in China more than 1,000 years earlier, paper-making knowledge had traveled slowly westward along trade routes, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century. Muslim papermakers had established thriving workshops in cities across North Africa and Spain, and their techniques gradually spread into Christian Europe. By Gutenberg's time in the mid-15th century, paper mills operated in various parts of Europe, including mills along rivers in Germany and Italy. These mills used water power to drive hammers that pounded linen and cotton rags into pulp. The pulp was mixed with water, and sheets were formed by dipping screens into the mixture, allowing water to drain away and leaving a mat of fibers that, when dried and pressed, became paper. European paper of this era was quite different from modern paper. It was made entirely from cloth fibers, giving it substantial weight and durability. The papermakers sized their sheets with gelatin derived from animal hides, filling in the spaces between fibers and creating a surface that would accept ink without excessive absorption. This sizing was crucial for printing, preventing Gutenberg's oil-based ink from soaking into the paper and bleeding through. The availability of paper made Gutenberg's printing project economically feasible. While he did print some copies of his Bible on parchment for wealthy patrons who wanted the traditional material, the majority of his production used paper. This allowed him to create far more copies than would have been practical with parchment alone, and at a cost that, while still substantial, was dramatically lower than hand copying. The paper available to Gutenberg was strong enough to withstand the pressure of his press, smooth enough to capture fine details from the metal type, and consistent enough in thickness and texture to allow reliable production. Paper mills could produce sheets in standard sizes, helping printers plan their layouts and calculate costs. Together, the oil-based ink and paper formed a partnership that made printing practical. The ink's ability to adhere to metal and transfer cleanly to paper, combined with paper's increasing availability and affordability, solved the final technical challenges that had stood between Gutenberg and his goal of mechanical book production. These innovations in materials joined with his advances in metal type and press design to create a complete system. Each element depended on the others, and each had required careful thought, experimentation, and refinement. Now, with all the pieces in place, Gutenberg stood ready to undertake his masterwork, to demonstrate what his invention could truly accomplish when applied to the most important text of his age. With his oil-based ink perfected and suitable paper becoming available through the trade routes that connected Europe to distant lands, Gutenberg possessed the technical foundations for his revolutionary printing system. Yet technical brilliance alone could not transform his vision into reality. The machinery, materials, and months of careful labor required substantial resources that far exceeded what any single craftsman could provide from his own purse. In the quiet workshops of 15th-century minds, innovation required not only genius but gold. The creation of a working printing press demanded significant capital investment. Metal for casting thousands of individual letters, presses constructed from sturdy oak, supplies of expensive ink ingredients, reams upon reams of paper or vellum, and the wages for skilled workers all accumulated into a formidable sum. Gutenberg needed workshop space large enough to accommodate the equipment and the careful work of composition and printing. He needed time to experiment, to refine his techniques, to train assistants in methods that had never before existed. All of this required money, and Gutenberg would need to convince others that his untested invention merited their financial backing. Enter Johann Fust, a wealthy merchant and goldsmith of minds who possessed both capital and the willingness to risk it on promising ventures. Around 1450, Fust agreed to lend Gutenberg 800 guilders, a considerable sum that would allow the inventor to establish his printing operation properly. This was not a gift of patronage but a business arrangement, an investment expected to generate returns. The agreement bound Gutenberg to specific terms, with interest accumulating on the borrowed funds and expectations that the printing venture would eventually yield profits sufficient to repay the debt and reward the risk. The partnership between inventor and investor represented a relationship that would become familiar in the centuries ahead, as new technologies and innovations required the collaboration of those with ideas and those with resources. For Gutenberg, Fust's investment provided the breathing room to move beyond small-scale experiments to full production. The money allowed him to acquire larger quantities of materials, to employ assistants who could be trained in the new methods, and to commit himself fully to perfecting every aspect of the printing process without the constant distraction of financial survival. 2 years later, in 1452, Fust provided additional funds, another 800 guilders, demonstrating continued confidence in Gutenberg's project even as the printing press consumed resources without yet producing the spectacular returns that might justify such investment. This second infusion of capital came with adjustments to their arrangement, and Fust became more directly involved in the operation. He brought in his son-in-law, Peter Schoeffer, a skilled scribe and calligrapher who possessed the refined sense of letter forms and layout that printed books would require. Schoeffer's contributions to the workshop proved invaluable. His intimate knowledge of manuscript production, his understanding of what made pages legible and beautiful, and his technical skills complemented Gutenberg's mechanical genius. The collaboration between these men, each bringing different expertise to the enterprise, helped transform the printing press from an interesting mechanical contraption into a practical system for producing books that could rival the finest manuscripts in quality and surpass them entirely in speed and cost. Yet financial arrangements that begin with optimism can sour as circumstances change and expectations go unmet. The printing operation consumed resources steadily while producing revenue slowly. Books took months to print, even with the new technology, and Gutenberg pursued ambitious projects that demanded perfection in every detail. The Great Bible that would become his masterwork required years of careful labor, during which expenses continued but income remained distant. The pressure of accumulating debt and interest created tension between the inventor focused on achieving technical and artistic excellence and the investor expecting timely returns on substantial capital. The accounts and legal documents that survive from this period paint a picture of increasing strain. Fust had invested 1,600 guilders plus accumulated interest, and by 1455, he moved to protect his investment through legal action. The lawsuit Fust brought against Gutenberg sought repayment of the loans and interest, and the court proceedings reveal the financial realities that accompanied revolutionary innovation. Gutenberg, despite his technical achievements, found himself unable to repay the substantial sums he owed. The legal judgment favored Fust, and the consequences proved devastating for the inventor. As settlement for the debt, Gutenberg lost control of much of his printing equipment and, crucially, his workshop. Fust acquired the tools and materials that the borrowed money had purchased, along with the skilled workers who had been trained in the new methods. Peter Schoeffer, who had worked alongside Gutenberg learning the intricate details of printing, continued operating the press now under Fust's control. The irony could hardly have been more bitter for Gutenberg. His invention, brought to fruition through Fust's investment, now belonged to his former financial partner, while he himself faced the prospect of starting again with limited resources. The business relationship between Gutenberg and Fust illustrates timeless tensions in the funding of innovation. Inventors must often seek external capital to realize their visions, creating partnerships that can prove fruitful or fraught depending on circumstances. Gutenberg needed Fust's money to transform ideas into working reality, yet the terms of their arrangement gave the investor claims on the very equipment and operation the borrowed funds created. When financial pressures mounted and repayment became impossible, legal mechanisms transferred ownership from inventor to creditor. Despite losing his workshop, Gutenberg persisted with his printing work, though the historical record becomes less clear about his activities in subsequent years. He appears to have continued printing in some capacity, perhaps establishing a smaller operation with support from other patrons who recognized the significance of his achievement. The exact circumstances remain shadowy, obscured by time and limited documentation, but evidence suggests that Gutenberg remained active in printing even after the painful separation from his original workshop. The financial struggles that characterized Gutenberg's career underscore an often overlooked aspect of innovation. History remembers the brilliant breakthroughs and transformative inventions, but the path from concept to reality frequently involves mundane concerns about funding, partnerships, contracts, and the constant challenge of securing resources sufficient to complete ambitious projects. Gutenberg's technical genius created the printing press, but realizing that invention required navigating the complex world of business arrangements and financial obligations. As Gutenberg's workshop prepared to undertake its most ambitious project, the printing of the Great Bible that would demonstrate the full capabilities of the new technology, these business realities provided the essential foundation. Without Fust's investment, the masterwork might never have been produced. Yet the same financial arrangements that made the achievement possible would ultimately separate the inventor from the operation he created, a bittersweet outcome that accompanied one of history's most consequential innovations. By the early 1450s, after years of experimentation and refinement, Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz was ready to undertake its most ambitious project. The pieces were finally in place, the metal type was perfected, the press mechanism worked reliably, the ink formula transferred cleanly, and the paper supply was secured. Now came the moment to prove that all these innovations could work together to produce something truly extraordinary. Gutenberg chose the most significant text imaginable for his first major work, the Bible itself. The decision to print the Latin Vulgate Bible was both practical and symbolic. The Bible represented the highest demand in the medieval book market, with churches, monasteries, and wealthy individuals constantly seeking copies. A successful printing of Scripture would immediately demonstrate the press's capability to handle complex, lengthy texts while also establishing Gutenberg's reputation in the most prestigious domain of manuscript production. The project would require every ounce of technical skill, artistic judgment, and organizational ability that Gutenberg and his workshop possessed. The preparations alone took considerable time. Gutenberg's team had to cast thousands upon thousands of individual pieces of type, each letter formed with precision in the hand molds. The font design they created mimicked the formal Gothic script used in the finest manuscript Bibles of the period, with its tall, narrow letters and ornate characteristics. This choice was deliberate, ensuring that the printed pages would meet the aesthetic expectations of potential buyers accustomed to handwritten books. The type included not just letters but also punctuation marks, ligatures where certain letter combinations joined together, and various abbreviations common in Latin texts. The workshop arranged itself around the massive undertaking. Compositors stood at their type cases, selecting individual letters and arranging them into lines within composing sticks. Each line had to be precisely the right length, with spacing carefully adjusted to create even margins. These lines were then transferred to larger frames called galleys, where they accumulated to form complete pages. The process demanded intense concentration and absolute accuracy, as a single misplaced letter could create errors in the sacred text. The actual printing began around 1452 and would continue for approximately 3 years. The workshop aimed to produce about 180 copies, with roughly 135 on paper and perhaps 45 on the more expensive vellum made from animal skins. Each copy would contain 1,282 pages, with most arranged in 2 columns of 42 lines each, which is why these Bibles are often called the 42-line Bible. The scale of the project was staggering. Printing just one complete Bible required pulling the press roughly 150,000 times, and the entire project involved millions of individual impressions. The rhythm of work in the workshop took on a steady, almost meditative quality. Compositors assembled type while pressmen prepared sheets of paper, dampening them slightly to help receive the ink. The pressmen applied ink to the arranged type using leather balls, working it evenly across the metal surface. Then they positioned the dampened paper carefully in the press, lowered the heavy plate, and turned the screw mechanism to apply pressure. When the pressure released and the page lifted away, it bore the crisp, black text transferred from the metal type. Each sheet had to be printed on both sides, requiring careful registration to ensure the text on the reverse aligned properly with the text on the front. The quality that emerged from Gutenberg's workshop astonished those who saw it. The letters stood sharp and uniform, each one identical to its fellows in a way that no scribe's hand could achieve. The deep black ink created by Gutenberg's formula possessed a richness and permanence that rivaled or exceeded traditional manuscript inks. The pages, once printed, dried and were gathered into signatures that would eventually be bound into volumes. Yet Gutenberg understood that his innovation needed to honor the traditions of fine bookmaking, not simply replace them with something crude or mechanical. To bridge the old world of manuscripts with the new world of printing, Gutenberg left spaces for decorative elements to be added by hand after printing. Large ornamental initial letters, called illuminated capitals, would be painted in later by specialized artists, along with marginal decorations and flourishes. This combination of printed text and hand-painted decoration meant each Gutenberg Bible was, in a sense, unique, customized to the buyer's taste and budget. Some copies received elaborate illumination with gold leaf and vibrant colors, while others remained simpler. This approach helped potential customers see printed books not as cheap substitutes for manuscripts, but as foundations for new works of art. The technical achievement of maintaining consistent quality across so many pages and copies cannot be overstated. Every aspect had to work reliably, the type had to withstand repeated pressure without deforming, the ink had to transfer uniformly, the paper had to accept the impression without tearing or smudging, and the press had to apply even pressure across the entire page. That Gutenberg system succeeded speaks to the thoroughness of his preparation and the skill of his workers. The financial pressure on Gutenberg during this period was immense. His partner Johann Fust had invested significant capital in the enterprise, and producing the Bibles consumed enormous resources before a single sale could be made. Paper, ink materials, and the wages for skilled workers all required steady funding. The metal used for type represented a substantial investment in itself. Everything depended on the project's success. By 1455, finished copies of the Gutenberg Bible began reaching customers. Those who acquired these volumes recognized immediately that something revolutionary had occurred. Here were books with the appearance and dignity of the finest manuscripts, yet produced in quantities and at speeds previously unimaginable. A manuscript Bible might take a scribe a year or more to copy by hand. Gutenberg's workshop had created 180 copies in roughly 3 years. The implications were profound, though perhaps not everyone grasped them immediately. Today, surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible are among the most treasured books in the world, housed in libraries and museums where they are studied and preserved with extraordinary care. Approximately 49 copies are known to exist in various states of completeness. Each one serves as testimony to that moment in the 1450s when a goldsmith from Mainz, drawing on years of experimentation and his deep knowledge of metals and mechanics, successfully brought together all the elements needed to transform how humans shared knowledge. The Gutenberg Bible was not merely a printed book, it was proof that a new age had begun, quietly announced in the steady rhythm of a press lowering and rising in a workshop along the Rhine. With Gutenberg's magnificent Bibles complete and finding their way into churches, monasteries, and the collections of wealthy patrons, the technology behind them could not remain confined to Mainz. The very nature of the printing press meant that those who learned its secrets would carry that knowledge with them, and as workers left Gutenberg's workshop and those of his competitors, they took with them an understanding that would transform Europe. The spread began gradually at first, then accelerated with remarkable speed. Former apprentices and journeymen who had learned the craft of setting type, mixing ink, and operating the press found themselves in possession of valuable skills. Some were hired away by entrepreneurs in other cities who recognized the commercial potential of this new technology. Others ventured out on their own, seeking to establish workshops where demand for printed materials was growing. Within a decade of the completion of the Gutenberg Bible, printing presses were operating in several German cities beyond Mainz. The first expansion moved along natural pathways of trade and communication. Strasbourg, where Gutenberg himself had worked years earlier on his early experiments, gained its own printing establishment. Cologne, a major commercial center on the Rhine, saw printers arrive to serve its wealthy merchants and its university scholars. Augsburg and Nuremberg, prosperous cities with strong craft traditions, proved fertile ground for the new technology. Each city that gained a press became, in turn, a training ground for the next generation of printers who would carry the craft further. Italy welcomed printing with particular enthusiasm. The first press south of the Alps appeared in the monastery of Subiaco in the mountains east of Rome around 1464, established by 2 German printers, Konrad Swainheim and Arnold Panitz, who had learned their craft in Germany. They brought with them not only the technical knowledge but also the equipment and materials needed to begin production. Within a few years, they moved to Rome itself, where demand for their services was greater. The Eternal City, with its concentration of church officials, scholars, and wealthy patrons, provided an ideal market for printed books. Venice emerged as one of the great printing centers of Europe. By 1469, the city had its first press, and within 2 decades, Venice boasted more printing establishments than any other European city. The reasons for this rapid growth were manifold. Venice was a major trading hub with connections throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, providing both materials and markets. The city had a tradition of skilled craftsmanship in various trades. Its relatively open intellectual climate and its role as a center of learning made it a natural home for an industry dedicated to disseminating knowledge. Printers in Venice produced texts in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian, serving diverse audiences across the continent. The technology jumped to France in the early 1470s, with Paris gaining its first press at the Sorbonne, the great university. The scholars there immediately recognized the value of printing for producing the texts their students needed. No longer would students have to share precious manuscripts or copy texts laboriously by hand. Printed editions could supply entire classes with identical texts, transforming the possibilities for education. Lyon, another major French city with strong commercial connections, soon followed with its own printing establishments. The Low Countries, with their tradition of manuscript production and their role in European trade, embraced printing eagerly. Printers established workshops in cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp. These northern establishments served local markets while also exporting books throughout northern Europe. The skill in design and illustration that had made Flemish manuscripts so prized now enhanced printed books, as printers in these cities combined technical precision with artistic sensibility. Spain saw its first press in Valencia in the early 1470s, followed by establishments in Barcelona, Seville, and other cities. England received printing later than many continental regions, with William Caxton establishing the first English press at Westminster in 1476. Caxton had learned the craft in Cologne and brought back both the technical knowledge and equipment needed to begin printing. His choice to print many works in English rather than Latin helped establish the vernacular as a language of printed literature in England. The speed of this geographical expansion was remarkable by the standards of medieval technology transfer. Within just 30 years of the completion of the Gutenberg Bible, printing presses were operating in more than 100 cities across Europe. By 1500, less than 50 years after Gutenberg's masterwork, presses could be found from Poland to Portugal, from Sweden to Sicily. This rapid dissemination reflected both the compelling economics of the technology and the hunger for printed materials across the continent. Each new printing center developed its own character and specialties. Some focused on religious texts, others on classical literature, still others on contemporary works in vernacular languages. Some printers concentrated on producing small, affordable volumes while others created elaborate editions for wealthy collectors. The diversity of output reflected the varied markets that printing now served and the different opportunities that printers recognized in their local contexts. The spread of printing required not just knowledge of the press itself but the development of entire supply chains and support systems. Each new printing center needed sources of paper, which typically came from mills that had been established to serve the older manuscript trade but now expanded production dramatically. Metal for type had to be sourced and refined. Craftsmen who specialized in making the precise molds for casting type found their skills in demand. Workshops that produced printing presses themselves emerged, adapting the wine press design to the specific needs of printers. The movement of printers across Europe created networks of communication and exchange. Printers in different cities corresponded about technical improvements, shared information about new typeface designs, and sometimes collaborated on major projects. The craft of printing, even as it spread rapidly, maintained a sense of common practice and shared standards that helped ensure quality and further refinement of techniques. As printing establishments multiplied, they began to transform the urban landscape. Print shops became recognizable parts of cities, often clustered near universities, churches, or commercial districts where their customers could be found. The distinctive smell of printing ink and the rhythmic sound of presses at work became familiar in European cities. The presence of a printing press came to be seen as a mark of a city's cultural sophistication and commercial vitality, much as earlier generations had measured civic importance by the presence of a cathedral or a university. This rapid proliferation meant that by the end of the 15th century, the printed book had become an established feature of European intellectual and commercial life. What had been Gutenberg's secret innovation, protected and developed in the workshops of minds, had become a continent-wide technology, adapted and refined in dozens of cities by hundreds of skilled craftsmen. The age of the printing press had truly begun, and with it came possibilities for the spread of knowledge and ideas that would have seemed unimaginable just a few decades earlier. As printing presses multiplied across Europe in the decades following Gutenberg's breakthrough, a remarkable transformation began in the very nature of what appeared on those pages. The workshops that had sprung up in Venice and Rome, in Paris and Lyon, in Basel and Nuremberg, were no longer content to simply reproduce Bibles and liturgical texts. The presses hummed with activity, and from them flowed an astonishing variety of books that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. The earliest printers, having mastered the technical challenges of their craft, turned their attention to discovering what readers actually wanted. They found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being able to produce books faster than scribes ever could, and they needed content to fill their presses and justify their investments in equipment and materials. What emerged was a publishing industry in its infancy, feeling its way forward, taking risks, and gradually discovering the enormous appetite that existed for the written word. Among the first works to emerge from these early presses were the classical texts that scholars had long treasured but few had been able to access. The writings of Cicero and Virgil, which had survived the centuries in scattered manuscript copies, now appeared in printed editions that could be reproduced by the hundreds. In Venice, the printer Aldus Manutius would later revolutionize this classical revival by producing compact, affordable editions of Greek and Latin authors, but even in these earliest years, the ancient wisdom of Rome and Greece found new life in printer's ink. Religious works remained central to the printing trade, but they expanded far beyond the grand Bibles that had first proven the technology's worth. Books of hours, which guided private devotions through the day, had been luxury items when produced by scribes. Now they could be printed in quantities that made them accessible to a broader range of the faithful. Prayer books, psalters, and collections of sermons found their way from the press to eager readers who had never before owned such texts. The medieval romances that had entertained courtly audiences for centuries discovered a new readership through printing. Tales of chivalry and adventure, stories of knights and ladies, of quests and tournaments, appeared in printed editions. These narratives, which minstrels had once recited and scribes had laboriously copied, could now reach anyone who had the price of a book and the ability to read. The stories of King Arthur, of Roland, of Tristan and Isolde multiplied and spread through this new medium. Medical texts emerged from the presses with particular significance. Physicians and surgeons had long relied on manuscript copies of ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, along with medieval compilations of medical knowledge. Printed editions meant that medical students could own their own copies of these essential texts rather than relying on the few volumes available in universities. Herbal guides, which described the medicinal properties of plants, became especially popular, bringing practical health knowledge to a wider audience. Legal texts found a natural home in print. Collections of laws, commentaries on legal principles, and guides to court procedures had always been in demand among lawyers and judges, but manuscripts were expensive and sometimes unreliable, with errors creeping in through repeated copying. Printed legal volumes offered consistency and availability, allowing the law to be studied and referenced with greater confidence. In an age when legal systems were complex and varied from region to region, these printed texts helped standardize and spread legal knowledge. The practical arts also benefited from the early presses. Books on agriculture explain techniques for improving crop yields and managing livestock. Architectural treatises shared principles of building design. Military manuals discussed fortifications and tactics. These were works that served immediate, practical purposes for readers who needed reliable information to pursue their professions. The printing press made expertise portable and reproducible in ways that transformed how knowledge passed from master to apprentice. Calendars and almanacs became staples of the printing trade. These annual publications provided information about feast days, phases of the moon, and auspicious times for planting and harvesting. They often included weather predictions, medical advice, and astrological information. Affordable and useful, almanacs reached a wide audience and needed to be replaced each year, providing printers with a reliable, recurring source of business. Works of grammar and language instruction appeared with increasing frequency. As literacy spread, people needed tools to learn Latin, which remained the language of scholarship, law, and the church. Latin grammars, dictionaries, and phrase books came from the presses in steady streams. Some printers also produced works that taught reading itself, recognizing that their own industry's growth depended on expanding the pool of literate customers. Travel narratives captured the imagination of readers who would never venture far from home. Accounts of pilgrimages to Jerusalem, descriptions of distant lands, reports of explorers and merchants who had journeyed to the east, these texts satisfied curiosity about the wider world. As European exploration expanded in the late 15th century, the printing press would become essential for sharing discoveries, but even in these early decades, readers demonstrated their appetite for tales of distant places. Poetry found new life in print. The verses of Dante, Petrarch, and other celebrated poets could now reach readers far beyond the courts and cities where manuscript copies had circulated. Contemporary poets also saw their works committed to type, creating a new relationship between writer and audience. A poem, once printed, could speak to hundreds or thousands of readers rather than the handful who might have heard it recited or seen a manuscript copy. Chronicles and histories emerged from the printing houses, recording the deeds of kings and the events of ages past. These works served both to entertain and to educate, providing readers with a sense of their place in the flow of time. City chronicles described local events and notable citizens, creating a kind of collective memory for urban communities. Universal histories attempted to trace the story of humanity from creation to the present day. Technical manuals on subjects as varied as mining, metallurgy, and mathematics appeared in print. These works contained specialized knowledge that had previously been closely guarded by guilds or passed down through apprenticeship. By appearing in print, such information became more widely available, though literacy and the ability to afford books still limited the audience. Nevertheless, the principle had been established. Technical knowledge could be shared through books rather than exclusively through personal instruction. The sheer variety of what emerged from these early presses reveals something profound about the moment when printing arrived in Europe. There existed a hunger for texts on every conceivable subject, a curiosity that had been constrained only by the scarcity of books. Once that constraint loosened, once the presses began to multiply and compete, the diversity of human interests and needs expressed itself in the remarkable range of titles that appeared. These first printed books, diverse as they were, represented just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape how knowledge itself moved through society. As the first printed books multiplied across Europe, finding their way from workshop to market stall, from cathedral library to merchant's counting house, something profound began to unfold. The world that had existed for centuries, where knowledge flowed through carefully controlled channels, where information moved slowly and reached only privileged eyes, was quietly transforming into something entirely new. The printing press did not announce its revolution with trumpets or proclamations. Instead, it worked its changes gradually, steadily, like water reshaping stone. In the decades following Gutenberg's Great Bible, European society experienced shifts that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations. The transformation touched every corner of life, from the grandest cathedral to the humblest workshop. For the first time in human history, identical information could reach thousands of people simultaneously, creating shared reference points and common conversations that transcended the boundaries of town and region. Consider the merchant in Frankfurt, previously dependent on memory and handwritten notes to conduct his business. Now, printed manuals on accounting appeared in his city's bookstalls. Printed tables of weights, measures, and currency conversions became available, standardized and reliable. he could purchase these tools of commerce for a fraction of what a commissioned manuscript would have cost his grandfather. The knowledge that once belonged exclusively to elite trading families gradually became accessible to anyone with ambition and a few coins to spare. In workshops across the continent, master craftsmen discovered something remarkable. The secrets of their trades, traditionally guarded and passed only from master to apprentice through years of observation and practice, began appearing in printed form. Technical manuals on architecture, engineering, metallurgy, and countless other crafts emerged from printing houses. A stonemason in Prague could learn techniques developed in Florence. A shipbuilder in Lisbon could study methods pioneered along the Baltic coast. The invisible walls that had kept knowledge localized were becoming permeable. The legal profession found itself particularly transformed. Printed law codes meant that legal knowledge no longer resided solely in the memories of judges and the collections of wealthy advocates. Statutes and precedents became available for study and reference, making the law itself more transparent and accessible. Merchants could understand the regulations governing their trades. Citizens could learn about their rights and obligations. The mystique that had surrounded legal expertise began to fade as the texts themselves became public. Language itself underwent a quiet revolution. For centuries, Latin had served as the universal language of learning, the tongue in which all serious scholarship occurred. But printers, ever attentive to market demand, recognized that texts in vernacular languages sold well. Italian, German, French, English, and Spanish works flowed from the presses. As people read in their native tongues, these languages became standardized. Spelling became more consistent. Grammar stabilized. Regional dialects began coalescing into national languages. A merchant in Cologne and another in Munich, reading the same German texts, found their speech growing more similar, their shared language strengthening bonds of identity and commerce. Education began its slow transformation from rare privilege to broader possibility. Before printing, teaching required either personal instruction or access to expensive manuscripts. A schoolmaster might own only 1 or 2 books, reading passages aloud while students memorized what they heard. Now, printed grammars, arithmetics, and primers became available. Schools could acquire multiple copies of the same text. Students could follow along in their own books, learning at their own pace. The pace of education quickened. Knowledge that once took years to absorb through repetition and oral instruction could be acquired more efficiently through reading. The religious life of Europe, so central to medieval culture, found itself profoundly affected. Printed books of hours allowed laypeople to follow complex liturgical schedules previously manageable only by religious professionals. Devotional texts in vernacular languages meant that personal piety no longer required Latin literacy. The Bible itself, appearing in printed editions with increasing frequency, became an object more people could hope to own. The relationship between believer and text grew more intimate, more personal, less mediated by institutional gatekeepers. News and current information began flowing through society in new ways. Printed pamphlets and broadsheets appeared, carrying information about distant events, royal proclamations, or matters of public interest. A battle fought in one country could be read about in another within weeks. Political developments, once known only through rumor and travelers' tales, became subjects of printed commentary. The speed at which information traveled, while still slow by modern standards, accelerated dramatically compared to the manuscript age. The marketplace of ideas became more crowded and more contentious. Printing made it economically feasible to produce texts advocating minority viewpoints or challenging established authorities. A scholar with controversial ideas could reach an audience far beyond his immediate circle. Debates that might once have remained confined to university halls or private correspondence could spill into public awareness through printed pamphlets. The control that institutions had exercised over which ideas circulated began to weaken. The printing press proved itself a technology that rewarded controversy and novelty, since such texts attracted buyers. Social hierarchies, long accepted as immutable, faced subtle challenges. When the son of a craftsman could access the same printed texts as the son of a nobleman, when learning became less dependent on birth and connections, the intellectual distance between social classes narrowed. The printing press did not demolish class distinctions, which remained powerful forces in European society, but it created new pathways for social advancement. Literacy and learning, once reliable markers of high status, began appearing in unexpected places. Across Europe, literacy rates began their gradual climb. In a world of handwritten manuscripts, learning to read delivered limited benefits for those of modest means. The effort required to achieve literacy seemed hardly worthwhile when books remained rare and expensive. But as printed books became more common and affordable, the advantages of reading multiplied. Parents who had never learned their letters recognized that their children might benefit from literacy. Schools expanded. Reading became a skill worth acquiring for more people. The transformation occurred slowly, over generations rather than years, but its direction was unmistakable. The cultural life of cities gained new dimension. Bookshops became places of gathering and conversation, where people of different backgrounds encountered each other through their shared interest in printed works. Publishers and printers formed their own guilds and networks. Intellectual communities that had once been confined to universities or monasteries began to emerge in urban settings, drawn together by their participation in the world of printed ideas. As night settles over this landscape of transformation, we might imagine Europe in the late 15th century, a continent alive with new possibilities, where printed pages carried ideas across mountains and rivers, where knowledge flowed with unprecedented freedom, where the barriers that had once seemed permanent were quietly dissolving. The press that Gutenberg had perfected was doing more than reproducing texts. It was reshaping human society itself, preparing the ground for revolutions in thought and spirit that lay ahead. As the printing presses of Europe continued their steady rhythm through the second half of the 15th century and into the 16th, something remarkable began to unfold across the continent. The transformation we explored in the previous chapter, where information became more widely available, now deepened into something even more profound. Books were no longer rare treasures locked away in monastery libraries or the private collections of nobility. They were becoming objects that ordinary people could aspire to own, to read, to learn from, and to use in their daily lives. The price of books began to fall in a way that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Where a manuscript Bible had once cost as much as a farm or a house, printed books could be purchased for a fraction of that amount. A printed volume might cost what a craftsman could earn in a week or two of labor, rather than a year's wages. This shift happened gradually at first, then with increasing speed as more printers established their workshops and competition grew. The economies of scale that printing made possible meant that each additional copy of a book cost far less to produce than the one before it. Merchants and shopkeepers, apothecaries and lawyers, skilled craftsmen and minor officials found themselves able to build personal libraries. A successful merchant in Venice or Nuremberg might own a dozen books, then 20, then 50. These collections represented not just religious texts, but practical manuals for their trades, books of history and geography, collections of classical wisdom, and works of contemporary literature. The knowledge that had once been the exclusive domain of the clergy and the aristocracy was now flowing into new hands, into new minds, across new social boundaries. The impact on education rippled outward like circles on a pond. Town councils and guilds began establishing schools, recognizing that literacy was no longer a luxury but an increasingly valuable skill for conducting business and participating in civic life. Parents who had never learned to read themselves saw education as a pathway for their children to rise in the world. A baker's son might learn enough Latin and arithmetic to become a clerk or accountant. A weaver's daughter might read well enough to help manage the family business or marry into a merchant family. Universities, which had existed for centuries but served relatively few students, found themselves with growing enrollments and expanding curriculums. Professors could now assume that students might own their own copies of essential texts, rather than relying entirely on lectures and communal readings. This simple fact changed the nature of higher education itself. Students could study at their own pace, compare different authorities, and develop their own interpretations. The relationship between teacher and student subtly shifted as knowledge became less about transmission of memorized wisdom and more about analysis and discussion. Professional training transformed as well. Before printing, a young apprentice learned a trade entirely through observation and oral instruction, with perhaps a few jealously guarded written notes passed down within a workshop or guild. Now, printed manuals began to appear for various crafts and professions. Books on architecture explained classical proportions and building techniques. Medical texts described treatments and anatomical knowledge. Navigational guides helped sailors find their way across increasingly distant seas. Mining and metallurgy manuals shared techniques for extracting and working with different ores and metals. These practical books did something extraordinary. They standardized knowledge across regions and allowed innovations to spread far more rapidly than before. A new technique for dyeing cloth developed in Florence could be read about and attempted by dyers in London or Antwerp. An architectural innovation from Rome could influence building designs in Paris or Prague. The printing press created networks of shared professional knowledge that transcended the boundaries of individual workshops and guilds. In the countryside, changes came more slowly but no less significantly. Almanacs became increasingly common, providing farmers with calendars, weather predictions, planting guides, and practical advice. These inexpensive printed pamphlets connected rural communities to broader currents of knowledge and information. A farmer in rural Germany might learn about agricultural techniques developed in Italy or France, slowly improving yields and practices through access to printed wisdom. The growth of vernacular publishing particularly accelerated this democratization of knowledge. While Latin remained the language of scholarship and international communication, printers increasingly produced works in German, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and other languages. A person could now learn from books written in their own tongue without needing years of Latin education. This opened reading and learning to vastly larger audiences than had ever before been possible. Women, though still excluded from universities and many formal educational institutions, found new opportunities for learning through printed books. Conduct books and religious texts were often explicitly directed toward female readers. Wealthy women built impressive libraries and engaged in scholarly correspondence. Even women of more modest means might own a prayer book or a practical manual for household management. The private nature of reading allowed women to access ideas and information that formal education denied them. The slow but steady increase in literacy rates across Europe testified to these changes. Historians estimate that in the mid-15th century, perhaps 5 to 10% of Europeans could read at a basic level. By the end of the 16th century, that figure had grown substantially in urban areas, perhaps reaching 30% or more in cities with strong commercial cultures and educational institutions. This represented an unprecedented expansion of literacy in human history, made possible by the availability of affordable reading material. Social mobility, though still limited by the rigid hierarchies of early modern Europe, became slightly more fluid. Education and literacy could help a talented individual rise beyond the circumstances of their birth. A clever merchant's clerk might establish his own business. A physician's apprentice who studied printed medical texts might gain reputation and clients. Knowledge was not yet fully democratic, not yet available equally to all, but it was spreading downward and outward through society in ways that would have profound consequences for the centuries to come. As books multiplied and literacy spread, the very nature of how people thought about knowledge began to shift. Information was no longer something rare and precious, to be received with unquestioning reverence from traditional authorities. It was becoming something to collect, compare, question, and debate. The stage was being set for dramatic intellectual and social transformations that would reshape Europe and, eventually, the entire world. As the 16th century dawned across Europe, the printing press that had spread from Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz had become woven into the fabric of daily life. Books were no longer rare treasures locked away in monastery libraries or the private collections of nobles. Instead, they had become tools that ordinary people could own, read, and pass along to others. This transformation of knowledge from scarce commodity to accessible resource created conditions that would reshape not just how people thought, but what they dared to think about. In the autumn of 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther walked to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg and posted a document containing 95 statements questioning certain practices of the Catholic Church. Whether he actually nailed these theses to the door or simply distributed them through other means remains a matter of gentle scholarly debate, but what happened next demonstrates the extraordinary power of Gutenberg's invention in ways that would have astonished even its creator. Luther's propositions were written in Latin, the language of scholars and churchmen. Within weeks, they had been translated into German and sent to printing houses across the German territories. By the end of that year, copies were being read in towns and villages throughout the region. Within months, translations appeared in other languages, and the ideas contained in those 95 theses had spread across Europe with a speed that would have been unimaginable just 70 years earlier. The printing press did not create the desire for religious reform. Calls for change within the church had echoed for generations. But the press transformed how these calls could be heard. A single manuscript copy of a reformer's writings might reach dozens of readers if passed from hand to hand. A printed edition could reach thousands in a matter of weeks. The technology that Gutenberg had developed to spread God's word, as he had understood it, now enabled people to debate and reconsider what that word meant. Printers recognized the appetite for these new religious writings. Pamphlets became a preferred format for theological arguments, short enough to be produced quickly and sold cheaply, yet long enough to develop complex ideas. These pamphlets circulated through cities and countryside alike, carried by merchants, students, and traveling preachers. A debate that might once have remained confined to a university or cathedral chapter now unfolded in marketplaces and family homes. Luther himself proved remarkably prolific, and printers were eager to publish his works. Between 1518 and 1525, it is estimated that more than 2 million copies of Luther's writings were printed and distributed throughout Europe. For a continent with a population of perhaps 75 million, many of whom could not read, this represented an extraordinary saturation of ideas. Those who could read often read aloud to those who could not, multiplying the reach of printed words far beyond the individual page. The technology also enabled Luther to translate the New Testament into German, completing the work in just 11 weeks during 1522 while staying at Wartburg Castle. Printed editions made this translation widely available, allowing German speakers to read scripture in their own language without relying on Latin texts or the interpretation of clergy. This directness of access represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between believers and religious authority. Other reformers followed similar paths. In Zurich, Huldrych Zwingli's writings flowed from printing presses. In Geneva, John Calvin's systematic theology reached readers across France and beyond. In England, William Tyndale's English translation of the Bible, though banned by authorities, circulated through the underground networks that printers and merchants maintained. The press had created channels through which ideas could flow, and attempts to dam those channels often proved futile. Catholic authorities recognized the challenge these printed works represented. Church leaders issued lists of banned books and sought to control what printers could produce. Some printers faced prosecution or worse for publishing forbidden texts. Yet the very nature of printing technology worked against effective censorship. Presses existed in dozens of cities across Europe, often in different political jurisdictions with varying levels of control. A book banned in Paris might be printed in Geneva or Amsterdam and smuggled back across borders in merchant wagons or travelers' bags. The press also enabled the Catholic Church to respond to reform movements by printing its own defenses and explanations of doctrine. Theological debates that might once have taken years to develop through correspondence and manuscript circulation now unfolded at the pace of printing schedules. Arguments and counterarguments appeared in rapid succession, creating a dynamic exchange of ideas that engaged readers across the continent. Beyond strictly theological matters, the printing press facilitated discussions of political organization, social structures, and the nature of authority itself. When religious reformers questioned the hierarchy of the Church, they inevitably raised questions about other forms of power and governance. Printed pamphlets explored these themes, carrying ideas about community organization, the rights of rulers and ruled, and the sources of legitimate authority to audiences hungry for such discussions. The press also made possible the standardization of religious texts within emerging Protestant communities. When every church relied on hand-copied manuscripts, variations inevitably crept in through copying errors, regional traditions, or intentional adaptations. Printed editions could ensure that churches separated by hundreds of miles used identical texts for worship, creating cohesion within movements that spanned diverse territories and cultures. Visual imagery found its place in this printed religious revolution as well. Woodcut illustrations appeared in pamphlets and books, making arguments through pictures as well as words. Some images supported reform movements, while others defended traditional practices. These visual elements expanded the reach of printed materials to those with limited literacy, conveying ideas through familiar symbols and scenes. The long-term consequences of this intersection between printing technology and religious transformation extended far beyond the 16th century debates themselves. The precedent of widespread access to texts, the experience of ordinary people engaging with complex ideas, and the demonstration that established institutions could be questioned and reformed through the circulation of printed arguments all contributed to broader changes in how European societies understood knowledge, authority, and the possibility of change. As printing presses continued their work through the middle decades of the 16th century, they were already turning their attention to other kinds of knowledge that would transform the world in different ways, carrying forward the revolution that Gutenberg had begun in his mind's workshop generations before. As the Reformation's transformative energy spread across Europe through countless printed pamphlets and treatises, another revolution was quietly taking shape in the minds of natural philosophers and mathematicians. The printing press that had carried Luther's ideas to every corner of the continent would soon prove equally powerful in changing humanity's understanding of the natural world itself. Before Gutenberg's invention, a scholar investigating the heavens or the properties of matter worked in relative isolation. A lifetime of careful observations might be recorded in a single manuscript, copied perhaps once or twice, then lost to fire, flood, or simply the passage of time. Natural philosophers in different cities might spend years solving the same problems, unaware that a colleague 200 miles away had already found the answer. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from master to apprentice, preserved in monastery libraries, guarded and rare. The printing press changed everything about how scientific knowledge traveled and grew. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed his revolutionary model of the solar system, with the sun rather than the earth at its center, his ideas could spread across Europe in printed form. His great work, published in 1543, reached astronomers and mathematicians from Poland to Portugal, from England to Italy. Scholars could read his exact words, study his precise diagrams, and engage with his mathematics directly. They could agree or disagree, but they were all working from the same foundation of information. This standardization of knowledge proved remarkably important. When hundreds of copies of a scientific text existed, all identical, scholars in different locations could reference specific pages and diagrams, knowing their colleagues were examining exactly the same material. Errors that might have multiplied through hand copying were fixed in a single printing. Mathematical tables, crucial for astronomical calculations, could be reproduced with unprecedented accuracy. The precision that Gutenberg had brought to the reproduction of religious texts now served the careful measurements and calculations of natural philosophy. The printing press also solved a problem that had long plagued scientific work: the fragility of discovery. A breakthrough observation recorded in a single manuscript might vanish entirely if that manuscript was destroyed. But a printed book, produced in hundreds of copies and distributed across a continent, became nearly indestructible as a repository of knowledge. Even if some copies were lost, others survived in distant libraries. Scientific discoveries, once printed, became permanent additions to humanity's collective understanding. Consider the work of Andreas Vesalius, the anatomist who revolutionized the understanding of human anatomy in the 16th century. His masterwork, published in 1543, contained detailed illustrations of the human body based on direct observation and dissection. These woodcut illustrations, printed clearly in hundreds of copies, allowed medical students and physicians across Europe to study human anatomy with unprecedented accuracy. Before printing, such detailed knowledge would have been confined to a small circle of students who could observe their master's work directly. Now it reached anyone who could obtain a copy of the book. The speed with which scientific information traveled increased dramatically. When Tycho Brahe observed a new star in 1572, his account reached astronomers across Europe within months rather than years or decades. When Galileo turned his improved telescope toward the heavens and discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, he could publish his findings and engage with other astronomers in a timely conversation rather than an exchange that might stretch across a lifetime. The pace of discovery accelerated because scientists could build on each other's work while still actively pursuing their research. Printing also enabled a new kind of collaborative scholarship. Scientific societies began to form, groups of natural philosophers who shared their findings through printed journals and proceedings. The Royal Society in London, established in the 17th century, published the observations and experiments of its members, creating a community of inquiry that spanned nations. A botanist in England could read about plant specimens collected in the Americas. A mathematician in France could engage with theoretical work being done in Germany. The printing press had created something unprecedented, an international community of scholars working together across distances that would have made such collaboration impossible in earlier ages. The accumulation of knowledge became cumulative in a way it never had been before. Each generation of scientists received the complete collected work of their predecessors in printed form. They could begin where earlier researchers had left off rather than rediscovering fundamental principles. Isaac Newton, working in the late 17th century, had access to the printed works of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and countless other natural philosophers. He could stand, as he famously remarked, on the shoulders of giants, precisely because their work had been preserved and transmitted through printing. The economic aspects of scientific publishing also mattered. While scientific books might not achieve the sales of religious works or popular literature, they found their audience. Publishers discovered that there was a market, albeit specialized, for works of natural philosophy and mathematics. This commercial viability meant that scientific knowledge could circulate through the same channels as other printed materials, reaching not only university scholars but also educated merchants, physicians, and curious gentlemen across Europe. The printing press also democratized scientific knowledge in subtle but important ways. While advanced mathematics and technical treatises remained accessible only to educated specialists, works explaining natural philosophy in vernacular languages began to appear. Educated people who lacked university training could learn about the natural world, follow astronomical discoveries, or understand the principles of mechanics. This broader engagement with scientific ideas created a larger community interested in and supportive of natural philosophy, expanding beyond the traditional circles of academic scholars. As the centuries following Gutenberg's innovation unfolded, the relationship between printing and scientific progress grew ever stronger. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries would have been impossible without the ability to share, preserve, and build upon discoveries through printed books and journals. The press that had begun by reproducing Bibles and classical texts had become the essential infrastructure of humanity's expanding understanding of nature itself, carrying observations and theories across oceans and generations with the same reliability that Gutenberg had first brought to the reproduction of texts. As we draw toward the end of our journey through the story of the printing press, we find ourselves standing at a quiet vantage point, looking back across the centuries to see the remarkable path that Johannes Gutenberg set humanity upon. The gentle clacking of metal type, the satisfying press of the screw mechanism, and the particular scent of oil-based ink have faded into history, yet the ripples of that innovation continue to wash over us today in ways both obvious and subtle. Gutenberg himself did not live to see the full magnitude of what he had created. By the time he died in 1468, printing presses had spread to several cities, but the true revolution was only beginning. Within 50 years of his death, printing establishments operated in more than 200 European cities. By the end of the 16th century, it is estimated that between 150 and 200 million books had been printed, a number that would have been utterly unimaginable in the manuscript age. Each of these volumes carried knowledge, stories, ideas, and information to readers who, in earlier times, would have lived their entire lives without owning a single book. The mechanical principles that Gutenberg refined remained essentially unchanged for nearly 4 centuries. Printers in the 1700s would have recognized his workshop methods immediately. The individual pieces of metal type, the composing stick, the form locked into the press bed, the careful inking, the pressure applied to transfer text to paper, these fundamental elements persisted through generations. It was not until the 19th century that significant mechanical improvements arrived with steam-powered presses and, later, the industrialization of printing through innovations like the rotary press and linotype machines. Yet even as the technology evolved, the core concept remained Gutenberg's gift to the world, the ability to reproduce text quickly, accurately, and in quantities that could reach vast audiences. This principle influenced every subsequent development in mass communication. When newspapers grew from occasional pamphlets to daily publications in the 18th and 19th centuries, they relied on descendants of Gutenberg's press. When magazines emerged as popular media, they too depended on the same fundamental process. The democratization of knowledge that began with Gutenberg's Bible continued to unfold in ways that reshaped human society. Public libraries became institutions dedicated to providing books to anyone who wished to read them. Public education expanded partly because printed textbooks made it practical to teach large numbers of students. The notion that ordinary people should be literate, once a radical idea, became an expectation in more and more places around the world. Access to information gradually transformed from a privilege of the elite to something approaching a universal right. The printing press also fostered standardization in ways that might not be immediately apparent. Before printed books, every manuscript was unique, with variations in spelling, punctuation, and even content. Regional dialects and linguistic differences made texts from different areas sometimes difficult to reconcile. Printing encouraged standardization of spelling and grammar, which in turn helped solidify national languages and identities. The process of preparing a text for printing required editorial decisions that led to more consistent versions of works, whether they were classical texts, religious scriptures, or contemporary writings. In a broader sense, Gutenberg's invention changed humanity's relationship with information itself. Before the printing press, knowledge was scarce and localized. What was known in one monastery might be unknown in the next valley. What one scholar discovered might die with them if they failed to train a successor. The printing press created permanence and distribution that allowed knowledge to accumulate rather than repeatedly disappear and require rediscovery. Scientific progress, technical innovation, and scholarly advancement all accelerated because each generation could build reliably on what previous generations had learned and recorded. The influence of movable type even extends into our digital age in surprising ways. The fonts on your computer screen, the layout of text in ebooks, and the very concept of publishing all trace their lineage back to Gutenberg's workshop. The term font itself comes from the complete set of metal type of one style and size. When we speak of uppercase and lowercase letters, we refer to the cases where printers stored their metal type, with capitals in the uppercase and small letters in the lower. The language and concepts of typography remain with us, adapted to glowing screens rather than pressed paper, but recognizable descendants of that 15th century revolution. Some historians have argued that the printing press was one of the most important inventions in human history, ranking alongside the wheel, agriculture, and the steam engine in its impact on civilization. This assessment seems justified when we consider how thoroughly printing transformed society. It enabled the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the spread of democratic ideals. It made possible the rise of the novel as an art form, the development of journalism, and the creation of encyclopedias that attempted to gather all human knowledge between covers. Johannes Gutenberg died in relative obscurity, his achievement not yet fully appreciated. The legal disputes with his financial backer Johann Fust had left him without control of his workshop. He received a small pension from the Archbishop of Mainz in his final years, a modest recognition of his contributions. Yet the legacy he left behind would grow far beyond anything he could have imagined as he worked in secrecy, solving technical problems one by one, driven by the vision of making books available to more people. In our own time, as digital technologies transform how we create, store, and share information, we find ourselves in the midst of another communication revolution. Electronic books, online databases, and instant global communication represent changes as profound as those that rippled through 15th century Europe. Yet the core impulse remains the same, the human desire to record what we know, to share ideas across distance and time, to learn from others, and to add our own voices to the great conversation that links generations. As you settle into rest tonight, you might reflect on the quiet power of the printed page, that innovation perfected by a Goldsmith in Mainz more than 5 centuries ago. From that workshop, through those carefully crafted pieces of metal type, flowed a river of knowledge that has not ceased flowing. Every book you have ever read, every newspaper, every magazine, traces its existence back to that moment when Gutenberg first successfully pressed metal type to paper and saw the clear, reproducible letters emerge. The story of the printing press is, in many ways, the story of how we became who we are today, one page at a time. As we bring to a close our journey through Gutenberg's remarkable printing press and the quiet revolution that spread knowledge across continents, we hope this story has gently carried you toward rest. From those first movable letters to the dawn of a world where ideas could flow freely, may these reflections settle peacefully in your mind. Thank you for joining us on this calm exploration through history. If these gentle stories have brought you comfort, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your breathing slows, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.